Well, just when you thought you knew all the players, a new twist in the Middle East makes things even more complicated. Yemen's civil war has been raging for months, but now with its Sunni Muslim government toppled and Shia Muslim insurgents on the doorstep of power, Saudi Arabia has entered the fray. This changes everything, a classic turning point. Janice Stein is a founding director of the Monk School for Global Affairs. Ray Boisvert is a former assistant director of CSIS, who paid special attention to Yemen. Saeed Khan is an internal affairs specialist at Wayne State University. And Samantha Nutt is the founder of War Child Canada. Their thoughts in a moment, but first, some background. To understand why this is important, you have to start with a map. Yemen, down here, wedged below Saudi Arabia and poised on the Gulf of Aden at the entrance to the Red Sea. It has been of huge strategic significance to anyone trying for influence in that part of the world. For decades, life was calm in what many considered a beautiful part of the Arabian Peninsula. But the recent turmoil in so much of the Arab world between its Shia and Sunni Muslim populations has impacted Yemen too. The Sunni majority is losing its grip to the Houthis, part of the Shia minority in Yemen. The Houthis are being resourced in part by Shia-dominated Iran. That's got Sunni Saudi Arabia so worried they're bombing the Houthis using targeting data supplied by U.S. intelligence. And we're talking serious bombing.
The main objective is to protect the government in Aden.
Last week, the Saudis had 100 jets in the air. To put it in context, that's more than 15 times as many jets as Canada has in its much ballyhooed air campaign in Iraq and Syria. So what does it all mean, and where could it all lead? Yemen may not sound like much, but when you realize that two of the most powerful countries in the region are going toe-to-toe over its future, it's cause for concern and questions. Time for some answers. All right, so we got Yemen in civil war. The president's fled. What's the main issue at stake here?
This is a local political story, Peter. A deposed president, Sunni, allies with the Houthis from the north, who have rebelled 5 times, and pushes out the new president over the border into Saudi Arabia. The new king in Saudi Arabia steps up big time, as you said, and Iran is involved on the other side, from a very local political struggle to a full-blown regional crisis. Local
politics started it all?
They certainly have a big part in this. The other issue, of course, is that larger piece of that Sunni-Shia split. It now has the potential to become the next big epicenter. With that, there's potential for some conflagration into the larger region. So things could get very hot and could draw in a lot of players.
All right. Help me understand the Sunni-Shia split and the role it's playing here. Saeed?
Well, it is a sectarian split, but that's not what the primary issue is here. As Janice said, this is really a political turf war. We have, after all, Ali Abdullah Saleh, the former deposed president, who is aligned with the Houthis, a minority within a minority. They are Shi'i, but they are a minority Shi'i sect. What is happening here is that the political alignments are such that it is a matter of settling old scores. And primarily for Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, they do not want to see any kind of political sharing of a Shia population, because we have Bahrain, which is a majority Shia country. There are a lot of Shia in the oil-rich part of Saudi Arabia. If Yemen has then what would be seen as a more democratic process, which has Sunni and Shia both in the government, that spells trouble for Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, who don't want to see that arrangement and, quite frankly, don't want to see democracy either.
All right. We've got to give Sam her due, because she warned us at the end of last year that Yemen was going to become the story this year. On this issue of the Shia-Sunni split, where are you on that?
I agree with what Syed just said. I think that, though I do think we have a tendency to overstate this as a Sunni-Shia sectarian problem. In fact, if you look at the Houthis, historically, they're not aligned with Iran. You know, they may have some support from Iran, but they are really on the margins of that. And so, for me, this is principally about Saudi Arabia. It is about Iran being in the ascendant in the region and Saudi Arabia's response to that and feeling threatened by that and taking a course of action to demonstrate their, unfortunately, to demonstrate their power.
All right. Help us, Janice, place Yemen. I mean, we saw the map, we get it, but in terms of its significance, why is it so significant?
You know, this is a desperately poor country, Peter, that is so strategically significant because of where it is. Today, 30% of the oil still is seaborne through the Straits of Hormuz, which is just around the corner. Yemen has the capacity to disrupt shipping. Were shipping to be disrupted, the pipelines, Saudi pipelines, can only pick up about a quarter of that 30%. So around the world, in Asia, China, Japan, India, these are big customers of Middle Eastern oil, and India, Japan are strong allies of the United States. So this desperately poor, it's the poorest of the poor, drug-based economy at the very tip has the capacity to send ripples right through the world.
Well, let's narrow that down, first of all, to the region. What's at stake for the region here, Ray?
Well, I guess I certainly agree with the political piece as being one of the central drivers, but as we've seen mirrored in other conflict zones of late, where there's a proliferation of weapons, where blood has been spilled, where violence is beginning to really percolate, there's the potential that, irrespective of initial alliances, people will move towards hardened positions and violence become the most suitable process. Part of that violence may now also include the ability to launch missiles, because there's a lot of Soviet-era weaponry, including Scud missiles in that part of the world. Aiming those towards Saudi Arabia from Houthi bases could cause things, as we saw, again, in mirrored images of Ukraine and MH17. So there could be some very, very significant moments emerge out of an area that now may become ungovernable. Equally important, it allows the al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, the Sunni franchise or the al-Qaeda franchise there, be able to really expand its base of operations. It also gives some of the subsets of them the opportunity to align themselves with the Islamic State and plant a flag there, which means that ultimately we end up having a lot more heat and a lot more potential for serious violence locally and maybe further abroad in a very short period of time.
All right. Saeed on that too?
Well, I agree with Ray. I mean, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula controls a good amount of the eastern half of the country. But notwithstanding that, I would say that we have to take a look at where Yemen is in the broader context of the Arab Spring. It's really the last of the democracies standing. Libya is gone, Tunisia is gone, Egypt is gone, Syria, of course, is in turmoil. Here we find really what is at stake, where a group of Gulf monarchies are trying to do their level best to go ahead and disrupt a democracy on their southern border. The most existential threat to the Gulf states is not a nuclear device from Iran or a belligerent Iran or even the Muslim Brotherhood. For them, the biggest threat is democracy, and we see that manifested in the case of Yemen. And that is probably one of the reasons why the Arab League has now mobilized 150,000 troops to go ahead and try to deal with the situation.
And we should keep that in mind, because as difficult a situation is in Yemen, over these past couple of years since the beginning of the Arab Spring, there has been some indications of movement on the democratization side in Yemen. Take it to the broader sense in terms of what's at stake for the West here. Sam?
Yeah, and I also want to add to this. I mean, I think that we can overstate a bit too much, again, the significance of the Arab Spring and all of this, and that this is a new phenomenon. This is not a new phenomenon. I mean, prior to 2011, Yemen was a failed state. This is a history that keeps recurring in Yemen, and I think that that's worth mentioning because it's not out of the norm. In terms of the West and the potential impact, this could be a monumental humanitarian crisis, again, on the scale of what we have seen in Syria. How do we we respond effectively to that? How do we keep civilians safe in that context? But also, we have shifting allegiances now. We are in Yemen, supporting Saudi Arabia, trying to oust a Shia, an Iranian-backed regime, which was the Houthis. We rely on that level of support, Iraqi Shia, the Iraqi government, and to a certain degree Iran as well, within Iraq to oust ISIS. So the more that our allegiances keep shifting, the more that our allies keep changing, that creates a real crisis of legitimacy in terms of the fight against ISIS and the potential response within Iraq and within Syria of those same parties that we need on side, who will then, be much more openly critical of U.S. foreign policy, U.S. intervention, and may reject those efforts outright. And I think it's a very complex and potentially dangerous strategy.
You want to add to that?
I would only add that this is a unique Saudi moment. Saudi Arabia has always led from behind. It's financed, but it's never stepped up. Under the new king, King Salman, this is really a significant moment. They organized this coalition, brought 10 Arab states and Pakistan together into this. Egyptian ground forces are ready. And interestingly enough, who's supplying, as you said, Peter, the logistics and the intelligence? The United States. So this goes a long way to repair the breach between the United States and Saudi Arabia that broke out when the United States helped oust Mubarak.
Now, Yemen has been used these last couple of years by the U.S. In its war against terror as a counterterrorism spot. How is that all affected by this?
Well, it's been greatly affected by the loss of their base of operations, with the United States government closing their embassy there. That then removed their ability to run human source operations for the CIA and other intelligence agencies. It also was part of the drone campaign. They had open approval to run those against Al-Qaeda in Arabian Peninsula, AQAP. And of course, now they're somewhat blind, somewhat deaf on the ground, and that's always an important part of the counterterrorism doctrine. The other big sort of strategic effect of this from a counterterrorism perspective is that this was the model for the U.S. administration, of where we could be one step removed, operate with special advisors on the ground in terms of military folks. You could have the CIA operations running sources and drone campaigns to reduce and somewhat put Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula on its back heels. It was almost at the point of being completely destroyed. Now, of course, that's gone, and the administration's now looking like they have no other alternative than dealing with other countries to do the dirty work, or look at some point down the road, if it gets really bad, do they recommit some ground forces? And of course, that seems unpalatable for everybody.
You know, I think most of us didn't know a lot about Yemen before it became so prevalent in the news in the last week, except, of course, Sam was all over it. But even now, what is it we don't understand about Yemen? Syed?
I think there's a lot of parallels we can draw between Yemen and Afghanistan. We have here a highly tribal society, a highly impoverished society, and many of the sectarian affiliations are subsumed into these family bonds that exist. And unfortunately, it's a country that has gone through so much turmoil. As Janice mentioned, a civil war that was in the 1960s with a lot of the same players that were involved, ironically, though, on opposite sides, the Saudis and the Egyptians back then. A country which only received unification in 1990. So again, a very young country, one that was in a failing or a failed state capacity, one that has never really had the ability or has had the luxury to stabilize itself and to create a coherent and a cohesive society.
Sam?
I think one of the things we don't understand in this context is, what does success look like? Picking up on what Syed has just said. You know, this is a deeply divided country. The more we push back against the Houthis, the more that gives Al-Qaeda and ISIS and other Sunni-backed groups the advantage. The more likely that is to lead to, the more that we emphasize the sectarian divisions and pander to those divisions on both sides, the more likely that is to lead to very serious civil conflict and strife with a tremendous loss of life. So I think that when we talk about what are the strategies for Yemen, to believe that this is something that we can defeat militarily from 30,000 feet is at best naive, and at worst potentially extremely destructive in terms of civilian lives. And we've already seen some of that.
We're getting pretty good at dealing with countries on this level in that part of the world and not knowing what success is supposed to be like and what an exit strategy is.
We don't know what the end game is. We don't even know what our objectives are here, really.
All right, time for a quick break. But when we come back, this question: how dangerous could this get? Welcome back to our Turning Point on Yemen, the latest flashpoint in the Middle East and perhaps the most dangerous. At the table, Janice Stein, Ray Boisvert, Saeed Khan, and Sam Nutt. So, Ray, how dangerous could this get?
Well, I'm afraid most of this could turn into a very, very bloody sectarian conflict, even though the base elements aren't as evident as some of our panelists are suggesting. The problem is that we're living in this complexity of environment that Sam talked about. It's changing the dynamic amongst a lot of those relationships. So we are moving forward into a new realm where nobody knows what the end game is, and there's a lot of shifting alliances. And I think at the end of the day, we're going to see Iran and Saudi Arabia go to extreme measures to win the day. So the only people who will really lose will be the Yemenis and the local regional sects amongst various countries in the region.
What's the worst case scenario?
An all-out regional war. The Saudis are really dug in on this one. The Iranians, I think, much less. This is not a critical issue, and there are big gaps between the Iranians and the Houthis. So the Saudis are looking for a win here, Peter, and they are going to stick to it until they get it. So it could be a very bloody war. The other worst consequence, of course, is that al-Qaeda reestablishes itself, has freedom of maneuver, and can inflict some real damage.
How likely are these worst-case scenarios, Sam?
I'm going to say that they're very likely because they're already happening. It is already a regional conflict. Al-Qaeda is demonstrating increased strength, as is ISIS within certain pockets. They're being pushed back from other areas. I think it's a very real danger.
Saeed, what are you watching for to see how this goes?
We don't know what the unintended consequences are. Half the Saudi army is Yemeni. We also don't know how Egypt or the Egyptian street is going to take this. I mean, they've already got a checkered past when it comes to Yemen. The fact that Sisi has gone ahead and committed Egypt into this war, and at this time it's not by Egypt's doing, it's basically answering the heed and the call of Saudi Arabia. There's every chance that the Egyptian street could get restive about this, and it could be destabilizing in that country.
All right. Well, as we've been saying throughout this, a very difficult situation with high stakes. Thank you all.